Somos Bonita Radio. Síguenos en youtube.tv Diagonal Channel Diagonal Bonita Radio, en bonitaradio.net, facebook.com Diagonal Bonita Radio y en Twitter, Bonita-Radio. En línea con tu mundo.
Las expresiones vertidas en el siguiente programa no representan necesariamente la opinión de Bonita Radio. Las opiniones son exclusivas de sus autores.
Bienvenidos a Puerto Crítico, un puerto seguro para la crítica, desde el amor y la alegría, desde el compromiso y la solidaridad. Un espacio de análisis y debate donde la ciudad y el pensamiento crítico son protagonistas. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a Puerto Crítico. Estamos aquí en Bonita Radio, en red global, a través del internet. Y en este programa en Puerto Crítico, en red translocal, ya que les habla Juan Carlos Rivera Ramos, alias Juanqui, desde San Juan de Puerto Rico, y Miguel Rodríguez Casellas, desde Sydney, Australia. ¿Cómo estás, Miguel?
Muy bien, listo para la segunda taza. La primera como que está todavía sentándose.
La segunda taza de café. Recuerden que Miguel está ahora mismo recibiendo el día jueves a las 8, perdóname, a las 7, 6 de la mañana o 7
de la mañana.
7 de la mañana en Sydney, Australia. Así que estamos muy contentos. Hoy es un programa especial para nosotros porque hoy es el programa número 100 de manera oficial. Así que de alguna manera eso marca un hito. Usamos el 100 como ese número simbólico y para nosotros simboliza aproximadamente 2 años y un poco más de programación casi ininterrumpida. Y digo casi porque obviamente han habido días feriados y épocas navideñas donde pues hemos decidido pues dejar una semana o 2 sin transmitir, pero rápido volvemos y hemos continuado de estar aquí presentes. Y hoy tenemos un programa especial celebrando esos 100 años, esos 100 programas, esos 2 años, y aprovechando también que tenemos con nosotros, dado que hubo una conferencia de estudios latinoamericanos recientemente en Puerto Rico, a una de las personas que yo estoy describiendo como una de las luminarias boricuas de la diáspora, uno de estos nuevas voces que están comenzando su carrera como profesores y en el caso de nuestro invitado como sociólogo, y hemos dedicado precisamente a nuestro programa de hoy el tema de la diáspora, y más allá de eso lo hemos titulado Las políticas de la diáspora, la pobreza y la demografía. Y tenemos con nosotros al sociólogo Michael Rodríguez Muñiz. Michael, saludos.
Gracias Juan Carlos y Miguel por darme esta oportunidad de hablar con ustedes.
Muy bien, quiero anunciar que este también va a ser nuestro primer programa en inglés y en Spanglish posiblemente. Así que vamos a cambiar inmediatamente el idioma hacia el inglés. Así que vamos por ahí. Comencemos, Michael, with your political trajectory. I think that it is very important for us to reflect about the diasporic experience, the Puerto Rican diasporic experience, specifically the political practices in the diaspora. And I think that you have a very rich experience, specifically from coming from Chicago, and perhaps it would be good to begin the program with a little bit narrative of your process, your political trajectory in Chicago, and let's start with that.
All right,
okay?
Sounds good. So I'm very glad to be here. I think an appropriate place, since I'm speaking in English, is to kind of give a little context of language, right? So I was born and raised in Chicago, and just a little broader context, one thing to kind of keep in mind is the Puerto Rican migration to Chicago, likely with New York, was met with a lot of resistance by the people who lived in the city. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of aggressive attempts to prevent Puerto Ricans from speaking Spanish. So as people may know, when Puerto Ricans migrated, like my grandparents and my grandmother, and my mother and my uncles, Puerto Rican children were put in closets to get them to stop speaking English, right? And so they grew up in an environment that was hostile to speaking Spanish. So I grew up in a primarily English-speaking family, and so like I bear that history on my tongue, but I understand Spanish quite well. And as growing up, in the process of trying to discover what it meant to be Puerto Rican, I turned to history. Where language was hard for me, I turned to reading books on Puerto Rican history as a way to kind of recover that. So I was raised in the Puerto Rican community, as many Puerto Ricans. There's about 100,000, 150,000 Puerto Ricans. But my upbringing was one of similar in many respects, was working class, trying to get by, Puerto Rican migrants from the 1960s and 70s. And just in the middle of high school, I started reading these history books, like I said, in Puerto Rican history. And I fell in love with Puerto Rican history. Just as a side note, unlike other Puerto Ricans, I quickly, after I was born, I went back to Puerto Rico. And then I spent 4th grade here. So I had some connection with the island, particularly Trujillo Alto. Families from Castañer. So shout out to anybody from Castañer who may be listening. So that was a transformation for me. And I started looking for where can I get politically involved. I was particularly interested in the Puerto Rican independence movement in those books. The figure of Albizu Campos I was fascinated by Albizu Campos. And I happened to be at church at the time, and I found out that there was a Puerto Rican high school named Pedro Albizu Campos. And nice. And I ended up going to that I didn't go to the high school, but I visited the outside. And outside of the school, it's in a different location now, you had big murals of the faces of the Puerto Rican political prisoners of war who were released in 1999. And there was a mural of Albizu and quotes and all this. And I was just like, this is what I was looking for, right? This was that connection. And when I got into college, I ended up getting involved with a magazine. The name of it is Que Onde Sola, which was started by Puerto Rican students in the 70s. And from that, I got involved in Humboldt Park, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center Juan Antonio Correal. I taught a class once at Albizu Campos with the Family Learning Center for young mothers. But my political development there, it was from the idea of Puerto Rican independence. I became politically involved around that question. And one of the things that I quickly learned in the specific way that politics plays out in Humboldt Park was that it had to be rooted as deeply as possible in community struggle. Like, it wasn't a question of kind of abstract ideas of like a free nation and all that. It was like at the level of cleaning the street. It was at the level of building institutions that were like Puerto Rican run and based. That was the lesson that I learned working with the executive director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Jose Lopez, who's a professor and an important, Oscar Lopez Rivera's brother, other leaders in the community. But they taught me a valuable lesson there, was to get rooted in the community. And I spent all of the time until I went to graduate school working in various programs.
Now, Michael, I think it's important, you mentioned the building institutions, and perhaps it would be good to share with the audience the fact that, as you say, the Puerto Rican Cultural Center does have this idea and struggle for Puerto Rico's independence, but at the same time is for self-determination of the different communities in Chicago. And actually, the center is pioneer in AIDS work.
Right.
Is pioneer in so many issues in the city that people do not here in Puerto Rico do not necessarily relate with the cause of independence or even any type of national identity work. Could you develop a little bit around that, because the contrast is so big when you think about independence or national identity in Puerto Rico, and when you see the work that is done in Chicago, it's like, okay, this is something else.
Right. Yeah, and I think so. A couple of things that I think are important to keep in mind is so on the one hand, you had the leadership of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, right? From the 1960s and 70s, there was a big riot in Humboldt Park in 1966. that leadership was largely based in Puerto Rico. They were the first generation that was either born in Puerto Rico but raised in Chicago,
right,
or was raised in, and so you end up having leaders who were rooted, like they weren't people who came from Puerto Rico to organize like the Puerto Rican community in Chicago. They were raised there, and so they had to deal with racism. They had to deal with discrimination, and so I think that produced an idea or a relationship to the Puerto Rican independence that couldn't be just Puerto Rican independence. Like, how are you going to organize in the Puerto Rican community in Chicago with the specific issues that face that community by just telling them that Puerto Rico, which in some cases they had not visited, their
right,
children haven't visited, they speak like I do in English, like without doing that community work, how do you make that political project happen? And so they
right,
became tightly integrated. And I think gives it its particular way that it's manifested as first and foremost community-based, rather than a kind of like philosophical or political experience of like theorizing what independence is. It's like how do you try to build an autonomous, self-determined, independent community? That's the challenge for us. Like all challenges, we haven't realized that, but that's the struggle. And I think our vision of Puerto Rican independence comes from there first.
Miguel.
Yeah, one simple question that I would like to, ask you is why do you think the New York community or migration community is more visible in Puerto Rico, it's more commented and discussed in the media than the Chicago migratory experience? There's a bit of and I know a bit about it, especially through Juanqui, because he lived there. He let me know some of the important struggles and accomplishment. But in Puerto Rico, in the media, it's almost intentionally invisibilized. Do you think there's a reason behind that? I know there might be a number issue here. I mean, it's a bigger migration, the one in New York than the one in Chicago. But is there something else here that we are missing? Why is so invisible in the media in Puerto Rico, the experience of the Chicago migration?
So I think, the numbers, I would speculate on this, right? So sure. I think one of them is the size of the population, I think, mattered, right? The way that the landscape of New York was radically transformed. And there was already, I think, also a long history. By the 19th century, you had Puerto Rican population. The Puerto Rican flag was developed there. So I think there's a longer history, and they've been weaved into the fabric of the city a lot longer. And I think at a size that was enormous in ways that Chicago wasn't. I think other things that I think could account for this, right? We might think that Chicago, there's a cultural element. The fact that you had the Nuyorican, you had all of the salsa, you had this like culture that now has been taken up by Puerto Rico, right? These were like diasporic creations that were then embraced by Puerto Rico and are part of the cultural, what we consider to be Puerto Rican culture. And Chicago didn't contribute that, right? What Chicago developed a little later was a politics, a political, community-based, independence, leftist-leaning trajectory, right? That's been anchored and has been part of that for now 30, 40 years. I assume that doesn't travel as well, right? That's not part of the imaginary in the same way that salsa, even though we know salsa
sure.
and Nuyorican were early salsa and Nuyorican poets were highly political and had substantial critiques. But I think those are some of the reasons why it may account for the difference.
Okay, with that, let's have a break. Vamos a una pausa y regresamos unos minutos a Puerto Crítico.
Soy el licenciado José Ariel Nazario y les invito todos los miércoles a las 10 de la mañana a escuchar el análisis legislativo único, política, sociedad, economía y temas de actualidad de nuestra realidad puertorriqueña. Recuerde, la previa, todos los miércoles a las 10 de la mañana por Bonita Radio, en línea con tu mundo.
De Letras es
un espacio protagonizado por la palabra escrita. Aquí disfrutarás de entrevistas a personas para quienes la palabra es el oficio. Gente que escribe desde sus pasiones, obsesiones, ideas, sueños, realidades y amores.
De Letras, todos los jueves a las 6 de la tarde por Bonita Radio, en línea con tu mundo.
Y regresamos a Puerto Crítico hablando de las políticas de la diáspora, pobreza y demografía con el sociólogo Michael Rodríguez Muñiz. Michael, and we were talking about that differences and perhaps the different popularity, if we have to say that word that way, between the diasporic experience in New York and in Chicago. I don't know if you wanted to develop a little bit more, or that was it, and we can go through to another aspect of our.
I'll just say quickly. Monkey just raised a couple things that I think we should say, right? Which is,
hey, if you want, that's fine.
No, I think it makes sense. I mean, so just the political. I mean, I didn't mention explicitly the Young Lords, but the Young Lords as founded in Chicago. I mean, so this is the other side, right? So we think about New York. And New York is important, and so there's always this Chicago-New York rivalry, which I'm not trying to
right.
to contribute to. But often when we talk about the Young Lords, you talk about the New York version, and the fact that it started in Chicago, it kind of gets erased from
right.
The popular imagination, the political, and even the academic literature. It's
right.
like very little on the Chicago piece. And other formations, like the Juan Carlos raised the question of the Latin Kings, right? The Latin Kings founded in Chicago.
Right.
So in addition to the political, you had the formation of gangs. And just to put that in context, the
sure.
wider situation where these Puerto Rican gangs came from in Chicago were the
sure.
explicit racism. I mean, so just a family, since in the spirit of like narrative, right? There's, I was talking to my uncle who reminded me, I mean, I never forgot, but he was narrating for me, when they moved to Chicago, they experienced a lot of very explicit racism. And so they moved in a building that was owned by Italians. The Italians set that building on fire. And so my uncle had to, be thrown out of the window by my grandfather.
Wow.
And he was telling me story after story, right? And so there used to be, if you talk to a lot of Puerto Ricans from that generation, they'll talk about being in high school and there was like Killer Rican Day, right? And so some of the early gangs really began, right, as like self-defense groups to protect Puerto Ricans. Since then, they've expanded their aims and objectives a bit further than that, but just to give that context, that's Young Lord started off as a street gang.
Right,
that was
right.
Originally sort of grows out of that in the Lincoln Park area.
Yeah, with Cha-Cha. That's right. Michael, okay,
Mm-hmm.
let's continue talking about precisely this diasporic experience, but also your sociological work.
Mm-hmm.
As part of your militant or activist work, you also participated also in publications. You were writing in the community newspaper and also in the university magazine, and you were involved in different reflections. You were doing, I remember, a participatory democracy
right.
project. So you got involved in many issues in the diaspora politics. And this is also being part of your reflections as an academic.
Mm-hmm.
How should we begin talking about this? Perhaps one of the things that we acknowledge in the difference between diasporic politics and Puerto Rico here
Mm-hmm.
is the importance of racism, and not racism, I mean, we have racism here also, obviously, but the anti-racist consciousness that exists in the diaspora. You just mentioned racism. You have mentioned the racist experience
Right.
since your first word here with us. Can you perhaps expand about that? I mean,
Yeah.
the importance of anti-racist work and the importance of racism in this whole experience.
Yeah, I mean, there's the conditions that we grew up in the Puerto Rican diaspora, where you feel like an outsider regardless, right? Numerically and in every sense. And of course, like here, we come in different color, shades and those kinds of things, and so that experience is different. I am light-skinned Puerto Rican, so my experience has been different from other Puerto Ricans who are darker. But all of us, to some extent, share an experience of feeling like an other constantly, right? When I would get here as a kid, when I came back in high school, get off the plane, all of a sudden I could relax a second, at least a second, in a way that in Chicago you couldn't. And so the politics we were talking about, independence, are also shaped by that reaction and resistance to feeling like a quote-unquote minority, or a racial other, in a very explicit, ongoing way wherever you turn, right? As you confront the sort of like white dominant U.S. society on a regular basis. And so I think that has produced a politics that are conscious of race in ways, right? And I think we can always do better about that and engage questions of race, particularly internally, a lot better than we have sometimes done. But it also has invited those kinds of forms of solidarity between different communities, the African American, Black community, solidarity with Mexicans and other racialized colonial people, essentially, right? And so that independence perspective isn't just about Puerto Rico. It's one that has taken into account the colonial and racial subjugation of a wider set of populations who are both, or all of us, are kind of inside the entrails of the monster, right? And so even the independence politics is shaped by that, like local racial order in the U.S. So.
Miguel, ¿algún comentario?
Yeah, I'm aware of how identity politics changed the panorama or the landscape of American universities, and it became a tool to introduce topics, difficult questions, even entire departments evolve out of the concept of identity politics. I mean, or question related to that. But I wonder, in today's contemporary academic, even political discourse, I mean, what are the limits of identity politics as a tool, as an instrument? Do you think we have to move on to something that is a bit more convoluted in concept? Because there is a history to it. I mean, identity politics is not just, it's not the same thing today that it was 30 years ago in terms of discourse and its capabilities to work as a tool. What do you think about it today? I mean, do you think we are reaching a limit to what we can do through the concept of identity politics? Are we moving on to something else?
I think, I don't think we've reached. So, are there limits? Of course, like any kind of political formation is going to produce some limitations, some exclusions. There's no pure political stance that kind of prevents us from having limitations, right? I mean, politics inherently generates limitations as it tries to push against them. And identity politics has, become a kind of catchphrase for very crude ideas. And in the U.S. context, the attack on affirmative action, anybody who says, we need some more representation of blacks or Latinos as a kind of like crude form of identity politics. I, for one, am not of the school that is willing to abandon the role of identity and collective identity in particular as part of political projects. There are people who are invested in, as you know, the critiques around, we started talking about identity and we forgot about class, or we started talking about recognition and not redistribution and those kinds of issues, right? But I don't think those are inherent to identity politics. And then, just as a counterpoint, I think we need to think critically about what identity does and what identity gives us, particularly at the level of it being a singular thing. So we could say, we're going to organize Puerto Ricans, right? But what does that actually mean, even if we say in the diaspora? Claro. We have to unpack that category. We have to think about the kind of assumptions we're making about who is a Puerto Rican and what are the kind of symbolic ideas that we have in circulation about what that category is. Of course, be concerned with issues of essentializing the population, that we create we police who belongs and who doesn't. I mean, those are real things that we have to engage with when trying to think about identity. But it can also be it still remains a powerful tool. For instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, right, is calling for, to some extent, a kind of inclusive idea of blackness, but is mobilizing the idea of blackness and the particular experience of blacks in the U.S. to say there's something very distinct about that experience, right? And it's giving a language for that I think is indispensable. And in fact, if they had decided to do a kind of non-identity One would I think, to erase some of the particulars that they're bringing to the fore, and would prevent us from diagnosing some of the issues that are being faced. So I think there's still work to be done. The question is, do we use identities as like a kind of sort of, we surround ourselves in this kind of exclusive notion and singular notion of identity, or do we think of identities as more in flux and fluid and as sites of political contestation, right? Identities are not like static things. They're things we struggle over to build community, to build political projects. And in fact, any political project needs to engage with, to organize the working class, one must articulate some kind of vision of what the working class is, some sense of identity. So I wouldn't say we've reached the kind of limit of it. In fact, I think we're at a moment where we need to think more critically of it, and I think we need to push back at the idea that the problem of the last 30, 40 years was the rise of identity politics, and that we kind of, that opened up doors that are again being closed. So
interesting, because you mentioned the Black Matter movement, and maybe it will be good. I mean, what is now that you just mentioned it, do you have some reflections about it? Because obviously when I look from here, I say, wow, this is the emergence of a new maybe radicalized civil rights movement, or maybe not. Maybe as you told me like a couple of hours ago, maybe they don't want to look at themselves that way, but we look at it, and it's for very interesting to see all this movement, about Black Lives Matter. Can you develop a little bit around that?
Absolutely. And quickly, just before I do that, I just want to say, in terms of like Puerto Rican diasporic identity,
sí.
The online magazine La Respuesta, I think, is an interesting place.
Yeah.
To think about like how questions of Puerto Rican identity in diaspora are being sort of negotiated, trans identities, Afro-Latino identities, dealing with questions of race, class. So people are trying to think about Puerto Ricanness in the diaspora, and I think La Respuesta is explicitly trying to think or reflect on a regular basis about the vast heterogeneity in the Puerto Rican diasporic experience, but all of the kind of challenges of organizing a kind of Puerto Rican community entails. Like, what does that mean? In terms of Black...
We have to pause. Seguimos? Okay, I'm sorry, continue.
So briefly on Black Lives Matter, I just want to say that I've watched it from afar, as many people have, and I've been incredibly impressed by the creative, passionate energy that's emanating from in Ferguson and around the country, Baltimore, of course. I think it's an inspiration. I think they've placed race, and particularly anti-Black racism, on the forefront in ways that people have ignored, with categories like people of color and kind of like larger categories that we forget the specificity of groups. And so I think for the Puerto Rican diaspora, as I was saying, is to look at that. One, to be in solidarity actively is vital. To think internally about questions of anti-Black racism within the Puerto Rican community, but also thinking of the tactics and the boldness and the courage as possible sources of inspiration for our political work and the work we need to do. And here I'm speaking in terms of the Puerto Rican community inside of the U.S., to take that as like lessons learned to move forward the agendas that are important for us.
Vamos a una pausa, ahora sí, y regresamos a Puerto Crítico unos minutos.
Ecos e Iconos es un espacio de amenas entrevistas. Hacemos un retrato radiofónico a los exponentes del teatro, la danza, el cine, la radio, la televisión, el performance e internet. Conversamos y a la vez documentamos de dónde surge una idea, su desarrollo, trascendencia y relevancia. Escuche a los Ecos e Iconos de la Cultura todos los sábados a las 2 de la tarde por bonitaradio.net.
Chico, ¿qué tú haces?
Aquí, a punto de ganar una subasta por internet.
¿Una subasta?
Sí, chico. Voy a completar mi colección de figuras de acción en pocos segundos. No.
Chico, ¿qué pasó? ¿Qué pasó?
Otra vez se cayó el internet. ¡Qué chavienda!
Ay, Dios mío.
Buzzer, la nueva técnica que ofrece estabilidad al Internet con planes residenciales desde $19.95 y comerciales desde $59.95. Llámanos hoy al 200-3535. Buzzer Wireless Network. Dale estabilidad a tu Internet.
Llegó tu programa deportivo,
Tu programa deportivo,
donde escucharás lo que necesitas.
y deseas saber
El añadido,
el añadido,
noticias,
datos,
predicciones
entrevistas
y más.
en
El añadido, todos los martes desde las 7 de la noche por Bonita Radio, en línea con tu mundo.
Y regresamos a Puerto Crítico hablando de las políticas de la diáspora, pobreza y demografía con el sociólogo Michael Rodríguez Muñiz. Michael, vamos a hablar, let's talk a little bit about your sociological work. I mean, we've been talking about your political trajectory, your take on different political dynamics in the United States. And we will also like to hear from you about your different sociological reflections on obviously society, but specifically the Latino experience in the United States, and another of your focus, which is poverty, how poverty is imagined and studied in the U.S. Perhaps we can start with poverty. And I think it's very good that we talk about this because it's totally relevant for us in Puerto Rico as well, since we also have developed a discourse on poverty that is very much influenced by U.S. sociology. So,
you know, I mean, the topic of poverty is very close to me because of politics. Also my reading of the way that Puerto Ricans in particular have been represented in the what you could call as like mid-century sociological, anthropological literature on poverty, particularly Oscar Lewis and others. And so the notion of culture of poverty that became very popular in policy circles and has shaped public discourse, you know, was developed in part on a study, a long-term study that Oscar Lewis, an anthropologist from the University of Illinois Champaign, in Puerto Rico. And so he observed the family in San Juan, I think it was La Perla, and New York, and that kind of migration and so Oscar Lewis develops a very powerful theory that became almost fact about poverty, which is, you know, if you put people in conditions of poverty, eventually they will develop a culture of poverty that will prevent them it'll shape fundamentally how they relate to the society. And even if the circumstances of poverty change, that cultural sort of baggage that was developed in conditions of poverty will continue to future generations. And so it created, even though Oscar Lewis's politics, actually, he was calling for a kind of like worldwide, or like a revolution, in fact, was the thing that could break it. The way it was picked up in the press was quite conservative. And so I wrote a paper, recently was published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, that takes a particular look at this subject, right? It's to say sociologists, social scientists have developed an idea, an approach to poverty, right? It's an area of research, area of study. And what I wanted to do was think about what's the kind of intellectual baggage that contemporary scholars look at. I mean, when you study a topic, you kind of stand implicitly or explicitly on a mountain of research and a bunch of assumptions, right? I mean, the very concept, what does poverty mean, right? I mean, a scholar doesn't just make that up. A scholar sort of draws on a school and a tradition and those kinds of things. And what came to mind for me was I was reading work in a subfield in sociology called cultural sociology. And cultural sociology is a pretty recent formation, but in the last 10 years started to take on the issue of poverty and inequality. And so I started reading that literature, and I said, well, they're asking, in some ways they're different from Oscar Lewis, right? And in fact, they say we're not Oscar Lewis, we're not Patrick Moynihan, we're not that group. However, if you look closely, the sorts of questions and preoccupations, the kind of focus that they give is quite similar, right? And so I wanted to think about how intellectual projects, just like political projects, have inheritances, right? That sometimes we don't call into question, right? We just kind of like keep working in the same kind of parameters that intellectual ancestors have left for us, right? And I think we have a very strong one. And so I make an argument, so the paper has two parts. One is a kind of theoretical exercise to talk about how we might break into those inheritances and those assumptions, and the second half looks at this research.
But I think one thing that I think is very important that you mentioned is the whole idea that obviously poverty is a social relation. It's a relation. It's not just a thing. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about poverty, we tend to, when I say we, sociologists, social scientists, economics, think about the poor. So studying poverty means studying the poor instead of why do we not study the rich? Why we don't study the elites? Why we don't study how elites get reproduced? And precisely they are not the main characters in this research. Is always the whole pathologizing of behaviors of black folks, Puerto Ricans, Latinos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So
this is the problem we have. And so the answer, part of the answer that I try to suggest there is that there's this kind of underlying sort of intellectual inheritance that leads people to think that the study of poverty is the study of the poor, right? And there's a history through the 20th century in U.S. and specifically U.S. studies of poverty that have increasingly gone from kind of a wider perspective to just the poor, what the poor think, what the poor do. And so you forget that it's a relation. You forget that, so you'll say, well, now we want to study what the poor think about finding a job or something, right? Which is in its own, like, you know, you can find important things there. But you don't ask yourselves, okay, or more important, why do students drop out of school, let's say? Right. And you can talk to them, but why don't we want to talk to the teachers? Why don't we talk about the curriculum? Why don't we talk about the cultural norms of administrators that look at students of color, black and Latino, as problems, right? And so because we have this like idea of what the field is and what should be studied, then we let a bunch of people, in a sense, off the hook, right? So we don't study elites. We don't study the relationship of like political elites in shaping public policy and those kinds of things. And so ultimately the paper calls for, as others have called for, both political actors and other intellectuals, for a new kind of poverty knowledge, right? A poverty knowledge that treats poverty as a relation and that says it's not enough just to study the poor. And I make like one point where I say that this is studying the poor is particularly important, is where we know that there's attempts by elites to exclude that population from public vision, right? If there's an attempt to stop a population from having a public presence, that we know it's an issue, then I think we have a duty to study that and kind of bring that to the fore. However, if it's just to kind of turn around the same questions and leave elites and all these other actors in play, then I think we're falling short from what the task is at hand. And we'll see if it gets received well, or if anyone pays attention to it, but that was the motivation, was like, we can't continue asking the same questions. We have to direct our gaze to a broader horizon if we want to study what the research says they're trying to study, which is the production and reproduction of poverty and inequality. And to do that, you just can't study the poor, quote unquote.
Miguel.
Yeah, I mean, going through, this idea of pathologizing the poor and poverty, Puerto Rico has been represented now in American media and even other international outlets, news outlets, as a place that has been irresponsible in its internal fiscal management, and almost there's something inherently wrong with our culture that is reflected in our finances, right? So there's been a lot of pathologization of Puerto Rico as a concept, as a place, as a government, everything. I wonder how the communities in Chicago, Puerto Rican communities, diasporic community, how do they look at us? I mean, are we being demonized also? So there's all this idea that, Puerto Rico is chaotic, we are irrational, we don't have access to knowledge, we are barbarians and that kind of thing. I mean, are some of these depictions, horrible depictions, being perceived as or naturalized by the Chicago communities of Puerto Rican themselves, almost as, well, you see, here is the island. That's what I escaped the island. That's what I move away from it because it's all about chaos and things like that. Do you think that kind of message is actually, percolating into the consciousness of Puerto Rican communities in Chicago?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, there isn't that I know of any data to suggest what those perspectives are. I think it would be a fascinating research project is to see that. I can tell you from my own experience being in repeated debate with relatives who live here and other folks that you meet that describe Puerto Rico as like the place you should not visit, shouldn't go outside, shouldn't do this. It's unsafe. It's this, that, and the other. Can't wait to leave, right? And then you have Puerto Ricans like myself and others that I know who are arguing with people who live here that, wait, you're like, yes, there's crime and violence and those kinds of things, but people act like where we come from and we live, those things aren't. You know, people say Humboldt Park is the worst place, has terrible reputation, right? Like, this is the worst of the worst, the most violent. And then you live there and you say, yeah, but there's beautiful things and there's community and there's sense of support. And so I think some of us take that, like we don't immediately buy into the negative representation of Puerto Rico because we come from places who are similarly considered the worst of the worst. And we're like, wait, we don't trust that. And so we are a little skeptical. Some of us are skeptical of that. But I think it would be fascinating to see, you know, how does Puerto Ricanos in Chicago or New York view Puerto Rico in terms of some of these issues. All I can tell you is that Puerto Ricans are regularly desperate to come here, even for some time. It would be nice to ask them, I know you like to visit, but would you stay here? And I think that would give us better answers to your question, is to say, one thing is like coming for a little bit, but will they come for a long time? And if they say no, then maybe they've bought into some of that ideas, among other, you know, reasons why they may not want to come here.
Michael, háblanos un poco sobre demographics, because that's another issue you've been, actually that's the topic of your dissertation. That's the main topic of your dissertation. How or perhaps you can explain better what is has been your late research about, but your most recent research about, but how is demographics used in the Latino or both Latino social movements of Latinos and Latino issues, and also public policy that is developed around the migratory demographic trends and whatnot. Can you talk a little about that? Do we have time? Well, we can begin and then continue after the pause.
So let me just say a little bit about the dissertation, which is super fresh. I just finished it about a month and a half ago. But
so you defended it and have
so far so good.
Okay, and it's gonna be a book soon. So
sooner the better. But so the project looks at, and I'm not sure how much of this like discourse makes it here, right? But in the United States, over the last 20, 30 years, but especially you could probably argue over the last 10 years, there's been a huge amount of public discussion, media coverage about the country's changing demographics. And people have called it the quote-unquote browning of America.
The browning.
That in 2050, right, the country will be demographically different. For the first time, whites will be a minority. And that means a lot of different things to people. And statistics play a key part in that, because the way we envision demographics and the demographic future is through statistical projections, right, that come primarily from census data and those kinds of things. And part of what I wanted to do in the dissertation is to say, let's not take those statistics as just facts, right? Those facts are contested, and in fact, political actors, or to use a sociologist, two sociologists that are Omi and Wanat, who wrote a book called Racial Formations, they have a notion called racial projects, which are political projects. Won't go into that. But there's contemporary racial projects that are using statistics to advance agendas, right? They have ideas about the future that are based in statistics. So you have, for instance, the Tea Party or nativist groups in the U.S. that look at 2050 and they're like, this is the end of Western civilization. It's all going to be over because there's too many brown people. Right? They have that perspective, and that's informed by statistics, but they also use those statistics to spark up like white anxiety. You know, the country's changing, they're taking over our jobs. You know, it's the end of the U.S. And then there's groups, Latino groups. The groups I study were civil rights groups, pretty mainstream organizations in Washington, D.C., who use statistics to say, look, in 2050, there's going to be these many amount of Latinos, therefore you should do X. You should invest more in Latino communities, or you should pass immigration reform. And so my dissertation looks at how, in particular, this population of civil rights advocates use statistics, ideas about demographic growth in the future to try to change the political scene and landscape today, right? So it's the relationship, and I frame it at the concept that I'm trying to develop something called temporal politics, the way that we use ideas of the past, present, and future, and we politicize them for political ends. So that's in a nutshell.
Vamos a una pausa y regresamos a Puerto Crítico.
Saludos mis amigos, mi nombre es Oscar Villarini y es para invitarle a que estés conmigo todos los jueves a las 7 de la noche en Musicaliza por Bonita Radio, en línea con tu mundo.
Y regresamos a Puerto Crítico con Michael Rodríguez Muñiz hablando de políticas de la diáspora, pobreza y demografía. Y precisamente talking about demographics, it's interesting because there's also a big demographic discourse in Puerto Rico that I think is, again, I'm not saying demographics is not important, but I think it's important to definitely analyze it, analyze the discourse and the different political imaginaries that comes out of that. And here, as Miguel was also somewhat suggesting, no, I mean, there's in the newspapers you read all this discourse about every month thousands of Puerto Ricans leave. There's a whole demographic of the older population in Puerto Rico, and all this picture of Puerto Rico as basically this place that is going to sink, and therefore we have to act in a way that we think is very conservative, very neoliberal, and basically pay all the debt that we have, and that's about it, because we have to set the financial record straight. So I think that the whole analysis of the discourse of the demographical discourse is crucial and definitely. Now it is also interesting because I thought about specifically Jose Lopez's use of demographics, and he also developed a whole, I could maybe think about radical politics around the possibility of a demographic vision, of Latinos being a majority, I don't know if majority, but a big number in the U.S. and then getting together with other Latin Americans in the Americas that I find interesting.
Yeah, you get that. What the future will look like demographically is super contested, and you can come up with a scenario where that's gonna, let's say, for instance, people who say, well, when Latinos become a big part or a majority, then the problems of race will go away. That's not Jose's position.
Right,
I want to clarify that.
Sure.
So there's a lot of different political projects are making claims about what the future will look like. And those could be more progressive or more critical. So some can call for solidarity and connection, such as the forming of a new majority, which looks for alliances among blacks, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, those kinds of things. Of course, you have the reactionary kinds of responses. But I think whether it's here or there or anywhere else, the issue is we have to begin to think, I think politically, I'm motivated by the fact that we take the statistics as fact, and we think that they don't politicize, that they don't produce anxiety, produce fear. They can produce hope, they can produce inspiration. But that deserves to be studied rather than assumed as the future is going to look a particular way because the numbers say it. And I'm more concerned with the kind of future we will have as a result of the political work people do today with a certain idea of the future in mind. That's... And we can't take those numbers for granted. And as you said here, you're absolutely right. You hear the story of basically the sinking of Puerto Rico run by statistics about migration, about crime, about all of these things. And what does that do? What is that? Whose interests are served by a particular narrative supported by quote-unquote science?
Right.
That's why people trust numbers. And so, instead, I think we need to unpack what the numbers mean who are the political actors, not necessarily just manipulating statistics, but
sure.
Mobilizing policy publics around certain ideas. And that makes me think that I would love to come here and continue
Research.
this work and and get to know some of that politics more. So.
Miguel.
Yeah, I mean, my next question is a bit of a cliche, maybe, but I would like to, bring it in. Things about identity also, especially when we talk about Puerto Rican identity, there's aspect of our own construction that can be considered anything but progressive. That is about sexism, homophobic, open behavior, comments, and things like that. So there's a lot of oppression that is coming from ourselves and our own construction. So when we use identity as a political tool or as a way of organizing ourselves, claiming a presence, how do we deal with aspects of our own cultural heritage or legacy that are problematic in a contemporary society that is about inclusion, tolerance, coexistence of differences and things like that. And it's always puzzled me because the Boricua, pa que tú lo sepas, as a thing, it has its limits also, and it's also a way of representing this kind of macho imposition on every aspect of the way we imagine ourselves and the way we live and communicate with each other. What do you think about that? I mean, and how that conversation is going today?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think to forget. I mean, I don't want to be advocating or interpreted to advocate a narrow, homogenized vision of Puerto Ricanness. And I think some of it is inescapable. The minute you say, well, we're all Puerto Ricans, even if you qualify by saying, yeah, but we're all kind of different, I mean, you're making an assumption that there's some common bond. And I think to the extent that we can make those public parts of political discussion, and my more immediate experience has been in Chicago and people trying to articulate an idea about Puerto Ricanness that was, engaged and willing to be kind of self-critical, right? To talk about homophobia, transphobia, anti-black racism, and some have been more effective than others, more central than others. And I'm not claiming it as having, solved the complexity, but I don't think I think that we need to fight for, if identity as a kind of just a sense of community or at a very base level is something useful, or if there's a kind of mobilizing capacity that can be pointed in a liberatory, radical, or progressive direction, then the challenge is going to be, how do we do that in such a way that we're constantly reflexive and reflecting on the limits of that politics, right? And make it as a centerpiece of the work, right? I mean, historically, what we know happens is you have a vision of Puerto Ricanness, hyper-masculineness, upper class, elite, kind of, and so then people say, oh, yeah, we have to take into account women, or we have to, and in fact, those are like actually periphery, right? It's just like a brief recognition that, some people are darker, there's a different class, and you move along with a kind of homogenous project, right? And I think we need to fight for something different than that. I don't have the solution, but I know that there are people working to try to make that happen on an everyday basis. Whether the category Puerto Rican at the end of that political work is the category we end up with, or we find something new, I'm not sure, but I think we need to take the challenge, and I think people are trying to in different ways. And I hope that in Chicago, whatever we've started and tried to do is something that we're going to continue to do and develop. Because I don't see a narrow kind of Puerto Rican vision, a narrow vision of Puerto Ricanness for me isn't attractive from a decolonizing perspective. And so we have to. That may not be a satisfying answer, but we're still working. We're trying to work it, but we have to be honest and upfront about the limitations of the category and the historical meaning of what we invest in. When people say Jíbaro, and we can pretend that it's not a race, classed, gendered category. I mean, if we pretend that, then we're going down the wrong path. But I think if we're going to embrace something like Jíbaro, then put it right up in front, the multi-layered, problematic dimensions of the category. I think at the very least we need to do that.
Muy bien. Así que con eso yo creo que vamos cerrando el programa. Es interesante. I think it's very interesting that in terms of numbers, in terms of identities, we're not talking about truth. We're not talking about facts. We're talking about constructions, and we're talking about basically how we mobilize hope based on the needs of the people, especially of those that have been historically excluded and oppressed. So at the end, we're looking for a society more just and based in social justice and in solidarity. Así que lo que funcione en ese proceso político, pues movilicémoslo para ser más libres y más justos. Así que nos vemos la semana que viene. Muchas gracias, Michael, por estar con nosotros. Michael Rodríguez Muñiz. Muchas gracias, Sixto, por ser nuestro técnico como siempre. Miguel, un abrazote allá en Sydney, Australia.
Abrazo a ustedes.
Hasta la semana que viene en Puerto Crítico.
Somos Bonita Radio. Síguenos en youtube.tv diagonal channel diagonal Bonita Radio, en bonitaradio.net, facebook.com diagonal Bonita Radio y en Twitter Bonita-radio.